Some people think they can get away with anything. They abuse their power, humiliate others, and laugh, until the moment everything changes. This story will leave you speechless. Watch until the end to see how justice is served. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the murmur of quiet conversations and the occasional rustle of papers. Officer Trent Lawson stood tall near the witness stand, his uniform crisp, his badge catching the light with each small movement. He had done this dozens of times before, testifying against people he had arrested, ensuring that his word was the only one that mattered. To him, this was routine. Then the doors swung open. A woman stepped inside, her presence impossible to ignore. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, she moved with the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively straighten their backs. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate. Every step was measured, deliberate. Lawson's gaze flicked toward her. Another black woman, probably someone's relative, hoping for a miracle that wouldn't come. He smirked, shaking his head, turning his attention back to the judge. He had long since learned how to handle people like her. But then she did something unexpected. She didn't sit. She just stood there, eyes locked on him, completely unmoving. It annoyed him. "Lady, sit down," Lawson snapped, his voice laced with irritation. "This isn't your business." The woman's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in her gaze, something sharp. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice smooth, controlled. Lawson sneered. He loved these moments, making sure people like her knew their place. He took a few steps toward her, dropping his voice so only she could hear. "You lost. This ain't the welfare office," he muttered, his smirk widening as he saw the flicker of reaction in her eyes. A hush fell over the room. The judge, who had been mid-sentence, faltered. Several people exchanged glances, sensing that something was off. But Lawson didn't care. He reached for the woman's arm. "Sir?" Her voice was sharper now, edged with warning. "Remove your hand." He tightened his grip instead. "Or what?" he challenged, pushing her slightly. For a split second, he expected her to stumble, to shrink back, to do what they all did when faced with his authority. She didn't. Instead, she moved with precision, reaching inside her jacket in one fluid motion. Lawson's instincts flared. His grip loosened slightly, his muscles tensing. He had seen this motion before. A sudden reach into a pocket, a fast movement. He had drawn his gun for less. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then she pulled out a badge. Not just any badge. The world tilted. Lawson staggered back a step as the reality hit him like a punch to the gut. His face, so smug just moments before, drained of color. The badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its weight undeniable. The woman lifted her chin slightly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Officer Lawson," she said, calm, unwavering. "I am Chief Jordan Tate, and as of this morning, I'm your new boss." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, stunned disbelief. Lawson's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind scrambled for an explanation, an escape, anything to make sense of what had just happened. The judge's gavel came down hard, demanding order, but even he looked shaken. For the first time in his career, Lawson felt something unfamiliar coil around his throat, tightening like a noose. Fear. The weight of everything, the arrogance, the unchecked power, the certainty that he could do whatever he wanted, came crashing down on him in an instant. His world, so carefully constructed, was crumbling at his feet. And Jordan Tate stood there, unmoved, watching him. She hadn't needed to raise her voice. She hadn't needed to threaten him. All it took was the truth, and now everyone in this room knew it. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. The weight of Chief Jordan Tate's words still hung in the air like an electric charge. Across the room, Trent Lawson stood frozen, his breath shallow, his fingers twitching at his sides. His world had shifted in an instant. Everything he had built, his unchecked authority, his reputation, was now at risk. He forced himself to straighten, clenching his jaw. This isn't over. The judge's gavel hit wood, demanding order, but the shock in his own eyes betrayed him. Jordan didn't move. She didn't need to. The truth had already done the damage. She turned to the judge, her voice steady. "Your Honor, I request a private discussion regarding Officer Lawson's conduct, both today and throughout his career. I believe it is relevant to these proceedings." A flicker of hesitation crossed the judge's face. He knew who Lawson was. More importantly, He knew who protected him. Lawson saw the shift too. He exhaled slowly. There's still time to fix this. The judge cleared his throat. Very well, Chief Tate. We will recess for 15 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, Jordan held Lawson's gaze. He could feel the power slipping away from him, inch by inch, and he hated it. She wasn't supposed to exist. Women like her, black, composed, untouchable, weren't part of the system he thrived in. And yet, here she was, tearing it all down. He wouldn't let her. Jordan stepped into the judge's chambers, where a defense attorney waited. She placed a thick folder on the table. Before we continue with Jamal Carter's case, I want you to see this. The judge opened the file. His expression darkened. Inside were pages of complaints, lawsuits, and internal reports. Every single one tied to Officer Trent Lawson. Why haven't I seen this before? The judge asked. Jordan folded her arms. Because he was protected. She leaned forward, but not anymore. A knock at the door. An officer stepped in, his face uneasy. Chief Tate, you might want to see this. Jordan followed him down the hallway. As she stepped outside, her stomach twisted. A cluster of reporters had gathered on the courthouse steps. At the center of them, Trent Lawson stood, flanked by his lawyer and several high-ranking officers. A microphone was shoved in his face. This is a political hit job, he declared, shaking his head in feigned frustration. I have done nothing wrong. I am being targeted because I uphold the law. Jordan's fists clenched. He was already spinning the narrative. She moved closer, listening as he continued. I've spent years protecting this city, putting criminals behind bars. And now, because of an agenda, my career is being destroyed? He laughed bitterly. What kind of justice is that? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some reporters nodded. Others scribbled furiously in their notepads. Jordan knew this tactic. Twist the truth. Play the victim. Make people question everything. She had seen it before, and she wasn't going to let it happen again. Before she could step forward, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Be careful. Lawson still has friends. You don't know what you've started. Her grip tightened around the device, but her expression remained unreadable. Inside the courthouse, Lawson slipped through the crowd and into a quiet hallway. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. He needed a way out. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. The line picked up. It's me, Lawson murmured. We have a problem. A pause. Then a deep chuckle on the other end. I was wondering when you'd call. Lawson exhaled. Backup. He still had allies. As he hung up, his confidence returned. Jordan Tate thought she had won today, but she had no idea what was coming next. Meanwhile, Jordan stood at the courthouse entrance, watching him disappear into the shadows. She didn't need to hear his conversation to know what he was doing. Men like him never accepted defeat. They doubled down. They fought back harder, dirtier. That was fine, because she was ready. The sound of her own heartbeat echoed in her ears. Jordan Tate stood just outside the courthouse, the cool evening air doing little to calm the fire burning inside her. Across the street, reporters huddled around their cameras, the latest footage of Trent Lawson's performance playing on an endless loop. He was already in control of the narrative. The words still rang in her head. This is a political hit job. I've spent years protecting this city, and now my career is being destroyed over baseless accusations. What kind of justice is that? The people who once whispered about his abuse of power were now uncertain, hesitant. That was his strategy, turned doubt into a weapon. She wasn't surprised. Men like him didn't go down without a fight. Her phone vibrated. Internal affairs. Be careful. Lawson still has people protecting him. She exhaled slowly, shoving the phone back into her pocket. She already knew that. Inside the courthouse, the halls had emptied, leaving only the lingering scent of stale coffee and polished floors. Jordan made her way down a quiet corridor, each step measured, purposeful. A closed door loomed ahead. She knocked once. The judge barely looked up as she entered. His office was lined with old law books, a silent reminder of justice in theory. He rubbed his temple, exhaustion evident. Chief Tate, he said, voice tight. I reviewed the files you provided. These are serious allegations. Jordan sat across from him, hands folded. More than allegations, they're facts. The judge leaned back. Officer Lawson has been with this department for over a decade. If there were real proof of misconduct, there is. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin manila folder. These are just the cases that were buried, but I believe there's more. The judge hesitated. Reopening them won't be easy. There will be pushback. Jordan's jaw tightened. I expected that. The door creaked open before he could respond. A young officer stepped inside, his expression uneasy. Chief Tate, he said carefully. There's been an incident. Her pulse spiked. What kind of incident? The hesitation stretched just a little too long. You should come see for yourself. She followed him through the winding hallways, past the quiet hum of printers and the dim glow of outdated fluorescent lights. Then she saw it. Her office, trashed, papers scattered, drawers yanked open, her chair overturned, the contents of her desk dumped onto the floor like discarded evidence. And on the wall, scrawled in thick red marker, 2 words stood out like a slap to the face. Back off. A slow exhale left her lips. Not fear, not anger. Something colder, sharper. She stepped forward, scanning the mess, fingers tracing over a single sheet of paper that had been left untouched. A case report. Marcus Avery. A name she knew all too well. Her stomach knotted as she skimmed the details. A black teenager shot during a traffic stop. The official statement said he reached for a weapon. There had been no body cam footage, no witnesses. The case had been ruled justified by Officer Trent Lawson. Her fingers curled around the page. This wasn't just a warning, this was a message. Behind her, the officer shifted. Chief, should I? No, she cut in. I've seen enough. She left without another word. By the time she reached her car, her mind was already racing. This wasn't random. Whoever did this wanted her to find that file. Why now? Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She answered. A familiar voice, low and mocking. Figured you'd find that sooner or later. She didn't flinch. Lawson. He laughed. You really think you're in control of this? Jordan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. You ransacked my office like a common thug. That's desperation. No, he murmured. That's a reminder. Silence. Then softer, almost amused. You're fighting a system that was built to protect men like me. What do you think happens when you push too hard? She didn't answer, because she already knew. Another chuckle. Be careful, Chief. The line went dead. Jordan didn't move, didn't react. But inside, something settled into place. She had been right. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was bigger, deeper. And if Lawson thought intimidation would stop her, he had no idea who he was dealing with. The city never truly slept, but tonight it felt restless. Jordan Tate stood in front of a sea of reporters, her fingers tightening around a small flash drive. Camera flashes exploded, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of urgency. In my hands, she said, raising the drive for the world to see, is undeniable proof that Officer Trent Lawson falsified reports, planted evidence, and covered up his crimes, including the murder of Marcus Avery. The air felt electric. A ripple of shock surged through the crowd. Gasps. Microphones pushed closer. The weight of the truth settled over them like a storm cloud about to break. Somewhere, Lawson was watching. Her eyes swept the perimeter, knowing this wasn't just about the evidence. It was about who still had the power. The press conference had barely ended when her phone buzzed. A text. You think this changes anything? She didn't respond, because she already knew the answer. Inside a dimly lit bar across town, Lawson sat alone, his fingers curled around a sweating glass of whiskey. The television in the corner blared the press conference on repeat. His world was unraveling. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one pulling the strings. He was the one being hunted. He gritted his teeth, reaching for his phone. The call connected. A voice on the other end, smooth and controlled. This is bad, Lawson muttered. A pause. Then, a slow, knowing chuckle. Not if we make it go away. The line went dead. Jordan arrived at the precinct just past midnight. The station felt off, quieter than usual, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. A young officer met her at the door, his face pale. Chief? You need to see this. She followed him down the hall, past rows of desks and tired officers avoiding her gaze. Her gut twisted before she even saw the damage. The evidence room had been hit, cabinets forced open, files missing, computer screens frozen on access denied. Everything she had compiled on Lawson, gone. A muscle in her jaw twitched. This wasn't a desperate move. This was calculated, precise, and it meant one thing. Lawson still had people on the inside. Her pulse steadied as she turned to the officer. Security footage. Get me everything from the last 3 hours. He hesitated. Her stomach dropped. What? All the drives were wiped. His voice was tight. There's nothing left. She exhaled sharply. Of course. She wasn't just fighting Lawson. She was fighting an entire machine built to protect him. Across town, Lawson leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders finally loosening. The firestorm would pass. It always did. Jordan had underestimated just how deep his roots ran. Or so he thought. By morning, news of the break-in had leaked. But instead of keeping quiet, Jordan did the opposite. She stepped in front of the cameras again, her expression unreadable. Last night, she announced, the police department's evidence room was compromised. Files stolen. Records erased. The crowd buzzed, reporters glancing at each other in confusion. But let me be very clear, she continued. When corrupt men try to erase the truth, they only prove why it must be exposed. She pulled out a small black case, unclipped it, and held up a second flash drive. Their mistake? She said, voice razor sharp. Thinking I didn't make copies. The reaction was immediate. Shouts, frenzied movement. The pressure on Lawson exploded overnight. For the first time, the department turned its back on him. His phone rang endlessly, texts coming in faster than he could read. Some told him to disappear, others cut ties completely. Even the people who had once laughed at his racist jokes and covered for his brutality were distancing themselves. By noon, the official statement had been released. Lawson was under investigation, indefinitely suspended. He gripped the steering wheel of his car, parked on the outskirts of town, his knuckles white. They were abandoning him. The very system that had protected him for years was discarding him like a liability. And then the final blow. His lawyer's voice was stiff over the phone. They have the video, Trent. A long silence. They're saying it's indisputable. A sharp exhale, a whispered curse. This wasn't happening. Jordan Tate wasn't supposed to win. But as he stared at his phone, watching his contacts fall away one by one, the truth settled in his chest like lead. She had. And she wasn't done yet. The city was on high alert. News stations ran urgent bulletins, their headlines flashing across television screens and phone notifications. Fugitive cop on the run after murder cover-up exposed. Helicopters thundered overhead as searchlights sliced through the dark streets. Every highway checkpoint, every airport, every bus station. Jordan Tate stood outside the precinct, her arms crossed, watching as her officers prepared for the inevitable. Lawson was running, but she knew exactly where he'd go. He wasn't the type to disappear into obscurity. He wouldn't flee to another country. No, men like him needed to feel in control. And that's what would be his downfall. Her phone buzzed, a private number. She answered without hesitation. You think this is over? His voice was lower now, raspier, tainted with something she hadn't heard before. Fear. You're done, Lawson, she said, her tone even. You've lost. A dry chuckle. You have no idea what's coming next. The line went dead. Jordan inhaled slowly, pressing the phone against her palm. No, she didn't know what was next. But she was about to find out. Miles away, Lawson gripped the steering wheel of his stolen car, sweat rolling down his neck. The city's glow flickered behind him, fading into the distance. He had planned for this, had contacts ready, fake IDs, an untraceable escape route. But something had gone wrong. People stopped answering his calls. The same officers who once backed him, who covered for him, who laughed at his jokes, were suddenly silent. They weren't going to help him. They were cutting ties before the entire system collapsed on itself. And for the first time, Trent Lawson was truly alone. He clenched his jaw, gripping the wheel tighter. If no one would help him, he'd help himself. His destination wasn't an escape route. It was a confrontation. Jordan stood near the docks, the wind whipping against her suit. She had been here before. Too many times. Waiting for men like Lawson to crawl out of the shadows. The air was thick with the smell of salt and rust, the warehouse looming in front of her like a silent beast. She wasn't alone. She had backup. But she had ordered them to stay back. Because this was personal. A car engine rumbled in the distance, headlights cutting through the mist. He had come. The door to the vehicle creaked open, and Lawson stepped out, his gun drawn, his stance wild and unhinged. You should have left it alone, Tate, he spat, his voice raw. You don't get it. The system made me. Jordan's heartbeat remained steady. No, Lawson, the system let you exist. Silence stretched between them, the tension pressing like a vice. And then he moved. Fast. A gunshot rang out. Jordan didn't flinch. Lawson staggered back, his hand clutching his shoulder, the weapon slipping from his grip. Her officers swarmed in, their commands sharp, their weapons drawn. "Don't move." For the first time in his career, Lawson was the one being given orders. His knees hit the pavement, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The badge that once shielded him was gone. Now he was just another criminal in handcuffs. As they dragged him toward the squad car, his gaze locked onto Jordan's. The same arrogance, the same hate, but beneath it, for the first time, something else. Fear. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The sirens wailed into the night as they drove him away. For years, he had controlled everything. But now he had nothing. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Every seat was filled. News cameras lined the back wall, their lenses capturing every flicker of emotion. In the center of it all, Trent Lawson sat in silence. No uniform, no badge, just an orange jumpsuit and a pair of shackles around his wrists. The judge's gavel slammed once, calling for order. Jordan Tate sat in the front row, her hands clasped together. She had spent years fighting men like him. But today? Today was different. The prosecution laid out the case with brutal efficiency. The body cam footage, the falsified reports, the testimonies of victims whose voices had been ignored for years. Lawson barely moved. His face was unreadable, but his fingers twitched against the table. He knew there was no escape. Jamal Carter took the stand, his voice steady. "This man treated me like I was nothing," he said. "But today, I'm here to make sure no one else suffers like I did." The weight of his words settled over the room. Jordan exhaled slowly. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. The final verdict came down. Guilty. A ripple of emotion surged through the crowd. Some gasped, others whispered. Lawson didn't react. Not at first. But Jordan saw it. The moment the truth finally broke him, his knuckles went white, his jaw clenched. For years he had controlled everything. But now he had nothing. The sentence was read aloud. 25 years, no parole. The judge's voice was final. "Take him away." As the officers escorted him toward the exit, he turned. His gaze locked onto Jordan's. For a moment there was nothing but hate, but beneath it fear. And then he was gone. The reporters swarmed, microphones shoved toward Jordan, voices overlapping. "Chief Tate, how does it feel to bring down Officer Lawson?" She didn't answer right away. She could have said it felt good, that it was a victory, but instead she looked directly into the cameras. "This was never about bringing down one man," she said firmly. "This was about holding a system accountable." The flashes of cameras, the murmurs. She turned, stepping down the courthouse stairs, past the reporters, past Jamal Carter and his mother, standing with quiet relief, past the young black kids in the crowd, watching her with something new in their eyes. Hope. The city felt different that evening, lighter, but Jordan knew better. This wasn't the end. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. One down, many more to go. She exhaled, sliding the phone into her pocket. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But tonight, justice had won.